if you think of ESG, I mean, corporate social responsibilities, internal controls, security, data privacy, inclusivity, diversity, harassment, these have all been around for a long time. Now, in some ways, the industry is looking for a framework to put this together and a reporting tool on how you report these things. So if we go to the next slide, please. So just keeping in line with the other two presenters, and if I start with the target buyers, sustainability officer is a really interesting one. We have started to notice more large organizations have a sustainability officer, a chief sustainability officer. And really the role that the COO, the chief operating officer, and the compliance officer were doing, and others, has now come together for the chief sustainability officer. Let's see how many times I say that word. And really their role is to communicate, to coordinate with management, with shareholders, with customers, with employees. You know, how do you address these issues? And how do you manage and monitor ESG on a day-to-day process? But one of the key things is, how do you actually make it operational? So it's fine to put metrics and things in place, but how do you take it to the next level and really operationalize it? And how do you bring it into your system as well? Sometimes these things are done very ad hoc. So the idea is that there's now someone who's looking at this across the organization to make sure they understand what's happening. And third parties been mentioned a few times in this meeting, and I'm also going to talk about third parties. They are critical to this story. I mean, at MetricStream, we've had some peer-to-peers, and we're talking to customers about ESG. And one of the comments that came up the other day was, you know, you're as strong as your weakest link, which is your third party. If you don't understand their risks and their ESG portfolio, then how are you meant to have something that you go out and you can report to regulators as well? And I'll touch on that a bit more. The other target buyer that I want to mention is just the program director for ESG. This is someone who's really coordinating everything and putting things together. You know, they're working with HR, where a lot of stuff sits. They're working with the compliance officer. They're working with internal stakeholders right across the business. And I think that's becoming key as well. And their role is increasing. We're also noticing that some people that come into these roles are coming in at a younger age. And that's because the purpose of an organization is becoming so important to them. And that's the route they're taking to really help, because they understand what's happening in the industry and the trends. If we go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So I'm not going to go through all of these points, but just to mention some things, especially on the corporate side. So investors, I mean, so if you look at private equity as an example, or the M&A desk, the deal desk as they're known in banks, they are now really looking at companies when they acquire or put them together as a strategic alliance to understand how they are working with ESG. In fact, if you get it right, your valuation can go up tenfold. And if you get it wrong, you can really tarnish your reputation. We hear about greenwashing in the industry, where people talk about things they're doing with ESG, and when it comes to measurements, it's hard to prove. So it's becoming critical. It's not just investors that are looking at this. Customers are very interested in what's happening with organizations' ESG. Now, airline companies, people are looking at flights and understanding, especially when they're traveling internally or they're traveling through work. Are they using the right airlines, and what are they doing, and are they showing their ESG coverage? This is becoming important to customers, to internal people within organization. And then the other thing is the regulatory landscape. So this is really interesting. If you look at what's happening in the regulatory world for ESG, you have places, or you have regulatory things like TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate Disclosure. Now, this has become mandate in some places. In the UK, out of the first G20 countries, they've mandated it last month. I think it was in May. Whereas other parts in Europe, as an example, have put this as a voluntary, knowing it will move to become a regulatory requirement as well. Then there's a GRI, which is a global regulatory initiative, which is another standard. There's the SASB. All regulations and frameworks are coming out, and it just makes people think that, you know what, they need to align to something, especially if you're a large organization that is public. You will have to follow some guidelines, and then there's guidelines depending on the size of the organization, how much turnover you make, where you have to tick a box. So the regulatory landscape in this space is becoming really important. Board of directors, they are now not just looking at profitability. Of course, profitability for an organization is critical. They also want to understand the purpose. Organizations that have a purpose are going much further. We are seeing this in the organizations, in the industry. We are seeing companies that have a purpose and are putting that down as their objective and their vision, are creating a really strong relationship, not just with regulators and investors, but through the organization. And they're the companies that people are talking about, because they're taking the first step in this. And then emerging climate and social responsibilities. Just to mention something on this, there is lots of changes happening. If you look at the climate agreement that happened in 2015, you know, there was a big push to make companies, organizations, industries, countries carbon neutral by a certain year. And this year we had COP26, which is Conference of Parties, to bring this again together with the same leaders around the countries to make sure that there is an initiative and there is purpose and we do have guidelines and there is a time frame. So Europe, as an example, have said by 2050 they will reduce by X number. Other countries have said 2060. There's different years, but everyone is now jumping on the bandwagon, knowing that they have to do something about the carbon neutrality aspect. And then on the other side of this slide, on operational, there is a real issue about lack of transparency and visibility within the organization with ESG. I mean, I've heard someone, again, in the conversations we had, someone said, is ESG just a fad, just another thing that will come in and then die out? Well, if that was the case, why would regulators really be harping on about this and doing so much more to push this through? It's becoming real. Some companies are embracing it. Some companies don't know where to start. There is data sitting everywhere. I mean, something similar to what Lauren and Pat were saying. We've heard about silos. The ESG data sits in HR systems, it sits in IT systems, it sits all over organizations, it sits with third-party providers as well. How do you bring not just transparency, but how do you bring all these things together? There is a focal point on this as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So everyone has a role to play with ESG. I mentioned just earlier just about HR, IT, third parties, supplier. Currently, one of the challenges out in the industry is that there's no visibility. It's very fragmented, how it's being reported, who does what, and that's one reason why the Chief Sustainability Officer and these roles are coming into play. It's really to look at this, to say, how do we bring the data together? How do we put it into a framework? I mentioned how data is sitting in different systems. Now, we talk about Excel a lot just with customers. People collect data on Excel files and Microsoft systems, which is fine to a certain degree, but when you're trying to bring things together, it's very challenging. There's also different systems, different versions. Only certain people have access to certain reports. All this thing needs to come together in a central framework. The challenge is also understanding not just where the data sits, but how do you locate and how do you collate the data? How do you bring this all together? And that's something that we at MetricStream are really focused on. If you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So hopefully it's obvious why there is a convergence between GRC and ESG. But if there isn't, if you look at the G, you know, this has been happening for a long time, the governments and the structure of what people have to do. And this is something that organizations have been doing with certain parts of the risk portfolio, but not with their ESG. And that's where the correlation comes in. And then risk just to what Pat and Lauren mentioned, sits everywhere. It's in all systems. You need to understand your ESG risks, which also sit throughout your organization. That's the R, bringing that together. And then I mentioned TCFD and some of the guidelines and frameworks. TCFD, as I mentioned, was a regulation that's come out in the UK. The compliance side is going to become increasingly more popular out in the industry, and organizations will have to adapt quickly. Third party, again, is key. You know, if you look at a third party and they might be working with child labor or something, which is the S in ESG, the social aspect, you know, that is going to reflect on you as a company if you don't have that visibility and what your partners and what your vendors are doing. So all that stuff has to also be reported, collated, and understood very clearly. Their risk is your risk. It's really important that third party is part of the GRC and the ESG story. If we go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So within the ESG product, we have disclosure frameworks. We have metrics, supplier assessments, policy, and board reporting. So just to mention a couple of these things, and I think these slides will be shared with you. A disclosure framework, the idea is to put a framework around all this data and what's being captured in a way that fits with the regulations and these frameworks that are being asked for. So it's putting it in the right format and collecting the data, which is a real concern out in industry at the moment. Metrics are really important. There's no point collecting this but not understanding what you're trying to do. If you think about it, there's two parts of this story. One is having the data, collecting it and understanding, but the other one is the purpose that I mentioned at the beginning. You need to know as an organization, what are the objectives? What's the purpose? Where are we going? Does everyone within the organization understand that this is the end goal? Do we have, and are we working to have a diverse board? Are we looking at all these harassment and things that may come up and logging them in a certain way that we are able to show that we are looking at our ESG score and putting things forward? It's becoming more transparent to some companies in how they work with this. The other things just to mention on this is board reporting. The boards are asking more and more now on what's happening within my organization or what's happening within the organization. And that's where dashboards become really important. It might sound like just, oh, here's a lovely picture to look at, but really with so much data, are you able to show the top line? Are you able to really give them the data they want to see straight away? That is why it's being put into a system that the output is easy for the board to understand, the senior leadership team. And the idea is that they can look at this, understand their position and make decisions. There's no point, again, taking this data and then not doing anything with it. So it's very much about making the right decisions and understanding where risks lurk, what's not been addressed, what we need to address. So that's something else that's really important. And then the final thing I'll just say about this slide is, how do you aggregate the data and map the data? And that's very much about the second bullet point, gaining access, better access for investors and the investment. It's really to make sure you have the data and you're able to show the data to the right people. If we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so how do we get there? If you think of if you know what a SIG is, like a standard information gathering questionnaire, in some ways, we can't get through to an ESG solution without gathering the right information. And what we're trying to do with our partners and customers is really start with an assessment form to understand where the questions they need to answer, where the data resides, and build that out with them. And this is what part of the framework and part of the templates do. We're building out questionnaires so we get the right data within the solution. It's then very much about how do you really look at remediation? You know, what are we trying to solve? What are we doing with the questions that have come in? And then move it towards a solution which is putting it into an automated way. And the idea with automation and AI, with this instance, is it'll start to look at patterns and understand this is what you're trying to capture. Here are more examples of things that are lurking within the systems to bring them to the forefront, because sometimes doing questionnaires can be one-dimensional until you look and add AI and automation to it. So we're building this up to make sure we're working with the organizations to put in the things that they are most concerned about. And if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so hopefully this is explanatory, but we have three offerings. We have Private, Premium, and Enterprise. The one, two, and all, which I think is an important thing just to differentiate, is some organizations, predominantly the the public and larger ones, will want to report to more than one framework. And that's what the one, the two, and all. So the enterprises will have access to all the frameworks. And that is important to them because some will be regulatory requirements, some will be things that investors are asking for. So they have to have that visibility. So that's what the first point means. Then the difference between Premium and Prime is very much that the system is also monitoring suppliers, which again is a key part of this solution. So we're looking at what the suppliers are doing and putting it into the system. And then when you go to Enterprise, one great thing is we have a supplier and a third-party login portal, which is just for them to log in separately. So they can add all their content, all their data into a third-party portal, which is used for them, which is linked into the system and into your organization to bring it all together. It's actually what we're noticing out in the industry is the larger organizations are very interested in the enterprise one because they want to be aligned to all the frameworks. I think they're the main things on this slide. If we go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is actually my last slide, and I suppose, like my presentation, fast. So if I just give you the high level, fast, quick collecting of data and integrating with third party. So some things to mention here. Sometimes customers are saying to us, where do we start? And I think that's a real asking and fair telling question. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to help them to get on board very quickly. And that's why we are providing a solution that is quick. You can get on the questionnaires and everything is pre-built. You are able to have a real focus on moving from the first stage to the second stage very quickly. And then collecting data. You know, I alluded to this in the past, the data sitting everywhere. The idea of this system is that it will pull data from the right tools, whether it sits in HR, whether it sits in IT, it uses automation to bring it together. And the point of collect once and report to many is really, really important in ESG. You don't want to do the same thing again and again. The system is allowing you to bring everything together that regardless of who the regulator or the guidelines might be, the output, because we work and we have the frameworks, will be pushed out in the right format as well. So that's very important. And then third party, again, key, something you've heard about throughout the three presentations. If you don't know your third party's risks, especially with ESG, you're as reliable in front of the regulators or the guidelines eyes. You have to make sure. And this system is bringing those risks in to the system as well. And it's not just risks, it's capturing all ESG requirements, which is a really good way to put everything together, work and move away from the silos and add automation in the process.